Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Birchfield Penny Arts Center Book Club. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'll share that the book club started in 2011 as a docent initiative. Actually, it was your friend Jane Roubaix who thought of having the book club here. We started by reading the books that were read by Charles Birchfield, so we had a sense of who he was and what his favorite books were, as we discovered by reading his many, many journals. But we quickly shifted over to reading books written by Western New York authors, which is totally in keeping with our mission for supporting the arts, artists, authors, and all poets and all the wonderful cultural, what's the word I'm searching for? Intellectuals and not so intellectuals of our community who bring wonderful things to us. And tonight I'm really excited that Sam Magavern, a great friend of the center, is joining us. But before we begin, I'm going to turn over to Michaela for a moment, who will share a little bit about how the procedure will be.
Sure. So everyone who's on Zoom right now, when we're doing the presentation, there'll be a PowerPoint. So please let me know if you cannot view it. And then if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. And this is also being recorded. And it'll be able to be viewed on our website and on YouTube after today.
Thanks, Michaela. And now I'd like to introduce my friend and fellow docent, Mary Devaney, who is going to facilitate this evening's presentation. So Mary?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to welcome everybody here. I think it's great. Again, nice group in person and a great group online. And I'm excited to introduce to you Sam Magavern. And we're just going to start out, Sam, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background and so on before we actually dive into the work.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is one of my favorite places to be. So it's an honor and a real pleasure to be here with you. So I am a public interest lawyer and writer and teacher who grew up in Buffalo and went away for about 20 years. And now I've been back almost 20 years back in Buffalo. Let's see. What else? I still work for a nonprofit that I helped to found called Partnership for the Public Good, which is a community-based think tank that does policy research and advocacy on behalf of community groups here in Western New York. And I teach a little at the UB Law School and a little bit for the Cornell University ILR School as well. And then I have kind of the other half of me, which writes poetry and fiction and nonfiction, and does other sort of literary cultural things.
Great, thank you. Now I have one big question, and then after that, you're on, but I really wanted to know what drew you to the work of Primo Levi?
That is a wonderful question. I first read him probably when I was in law school. And I was trying to remember whether I read, it was either the periodic table or what was then in English titled Survival in Auschwitz. Now it's been retranslated and given its proper name, which is If This Is a Man. And so I read one of those two books, and then I read the other one and was very captivated by this brilliant writer with an incredible life story. And then didn't read a lot else by him for a number of years. Was still sort of interested in him, would kind of see articles about him, particularly after his death. And then I was working on a novel, and the novel was about a group of law students and other friends in Los Angeles in the late 1980s, which is when I lived there and went to law school there, coincidentally. And for some reason, I decided that one of the characters would be very interested in Primo Levi. And I can't really tell you why. It just seemed right for the novel to have this character be very interested in him. And so that got me rereading what I had read and then reading more of his work. And then that was spiraling out of control, where I had all this stuff about Primo Levi that I wanted to cram into this novel that was really about a lot of other stuff too, and it couldn't sort of become the Primo Levi novel. And so I thought, well, okay, maybe I'll write a little essay about him on the side and express some of my thoughts about him that way, and then I don't have to try and fit them all into this novel. So I started writing this little essay, and then the little essay grew and grew. And so at this point, I basically read everything that had been translated into English because I don't speak any Italian at all. But luckily, all his major work is available in English and was at the time as well. And then there were two very good biographies of him. So I read those. And that was what I was working with, was just everything by him, plus two biographies, and then interviews with him, and really not much else in terms of material. I couldn't read his letters or do original, archival research or anything like that. So really, I was just responding as a reader who found him to be a wonderful writer and a very fascinating human. And, he stirred a lot of thoughts in me that I wanted to, try and express. And that's how the book came about. So it's a very accidental book in a lot of ways. And I'm always a little embarrassed because I, speak no Italian. I've never been to Italy. I know a little Italian literature now, but I didn't know much when I wrote this book. And I was not in no way an expert on the Holocaust or on Holocaust literature. I haven't read really the classic texts of Holocaust literature. I've read very few of. So, I wasn't very much not an expert, but also, my interest was very much just in this amazing writer and human being. And so it was very focused on him and his story, and it doesn't pull in a huge amount of other other material or comparisons to other authors or that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, from reading your book and then also reading Levi's first book, it really helped me kind of understand it better because you go into so much detail. So I really recommend read your book first and then start reading. And it really, it is so interesting, all the, your insights. And I think it's so fit well with the book. So really, really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, we're actually going to look at your poetry, at his poetry today and go through, we're going to share some poems with everybody. And at the end of the poem, we can have maybe one question. We're going to try to keep that as a minimum so we can keep things moving. But then at the end, we'll have time for other questions as well. Okay, so take
great,
it away.
thank you. So it's an unusual route we're taking into Primo Levi. He is not really famous for his poetry, and he himself did not value his poetry that highly. But I think it's fantastic and underappreciated. And I also think it gives you a very quick, interesting route into him and his writing and his personality. Why did he value his poetry more? Well, a couple of reasons. He was a scientist, a chemist. He wanted to be a physicist. The fascist laws prevented him from pursuing physics, so he became a chemist. Worked almost all his life, or the big part of his career, he managed a paint and varnish factory, or worked as a scientist at a paint and varnish factory. So he really valued reason, science, and work. And poetry to him was kind of the opposite of that. It was very irrational. And it wasn't something you could plan out and sit down and work on. It would just sort of erupt. He compared it to a rash. He said it happened in uncertain hours, which is a quote from Coleridge, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was a really central poem for him because it's about someone who survives something horrible and then is compelled to talk about it and tell people about it. And that happens at uncertain hours. So he had a kind of predisposition against poetry, which helps to explain why he wouldn't have valued something he was so good at a little more. But he did write poetry throughout his life. He started as a young man before Auschwitz. Right when he came back from Auschwitz, he wrote a number of really important poems, and then he continued writing throughout his life until the very end. Beautiful poems. And two of his most important books, his first two books, If This Is a Man and The Truce, he starts both books with poems, which it means they were very important. You know, you don't start a book with something that's not important. And in particular, the poem that starts his first book, still his most important book, and you know, for me, his masterpiece. Although I think a lot of his books are masterpieces or great books. But If This Is a Man, you know, if you only read one book by him, that would be the one to read. And that opens with this poem, Shema. And so we're going to start by looking at that. Before I read you the poem, I'll just say a few things about it. So the Shema is the most important Jewish prayer. It's the one that is said twice a day, mornings and evenings. It's the one that's kind of climaxes the Yom Kippur service. It's the most important Jewish service of the year. In Jewish history and legend, martyrs are often portrayed as saying the Shema as they die. The greatest Jewish sage, Rabbi Akiba, that's the legend of how he died, was saying the Shema. So it's a very, very important poem, very central to Judaism. And the poem is, the prayer rather, it's just straight from the Bible. It's two sections from Deuteronomy and then one passage from Numbers. So in the King James Version, the way the Deuteronomy passage starts is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words, which I command thee this day, shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." So that's God talking to the people of Israel via Moses, or with Moses on hand. So for Primo Levi, who was a non-observant Jew, more or less an atheist, although he never completely ruled out God, he once said, well, there was Auschwitz, so there cannot be God. And that was kind of his strongest feeling, but he didn't completely shut the door, but he was not, a believer in any conventional sense. So for him to start this book with a poem called Shema that mirrors the language of the prayer was a very bold move. He was this unknown young chemist writing an Auschwitz testimony. So bear that in mind as you hear it. And then we'll talk about it a little more. So the poem says, Shema, you who live secure in your warm houses, who return at evening to find hot food and friendly faces, consider whether this is a man who labors in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies at a yes or a no. Consider whether this is a woman without hair or name, with no more strength to remember, eyes empty and womb cold as a frog in winter. Consider that this has been. I commend these words to you. Engrave them on your hearts when you are in your house, when you walk on your way, when you go to bed, when you rise. Repeat them to your children, or may your house crumble, disease render you powerless, your offspring avert their faces from you. And as you see, it was written, this is when he wrote it, January 10th, 1946, so very fresh after his return to Italy after the war. And you notice that it ends with a curse, and you notice that the curse is really directed at it's not directed at the Nazis. It's directed at the Jewish people and people in general, humanity, but telling them that these words that he is speaking and is going to speak in writing this book are this important. So he's a very modest man in many ways, but this is, astonishing, really, boldness for him to do this at the beginning of his book. So the book is called "If This Is a Man," and the most powerful theme in the book is that the Nazis did not just destroy lives, but they destroyed souls. I mean, that's what makes it a very terrifying book. And the back cover of the old American edition that I first read said that it was a testament to the indestructibility of the human spirit. And that's really the exact opposite of what the book is. It's a witness to the destructibility of the human spirit. And that's why using the Shema and this religious framework is so sort of shocking in many ways, because the dominant theme of the book is very unreligious. It's that human beings can destroy each other's souls, and that happened at Auschwitz. Now, we'll talk later about how his feelings were more ambiguous than what I just said. And even within the "If This Is a Man," well, the title tells you right away, if this is a man, it's not, this is not a man. But you have to grapple with his portrayal of the Nazis in Auschwitz as successfully destroying human souls and the human spirit. And that's reflected, in this poem. And that dehumanizing language, comparing a woman and her womb to a frog in winter, is, very stark, terrifying language. That's the Shema. So, as Mary said, I thought what we might do to keep it a little bit interactive, but also sort of keep it going, was just take one question after each poem and then keep going. So, does anyone have online or in person have one question about Shema? Yeah.
Who translated these poems?
Oh, so there are two main translations available. So there's an old collected poem, volume of collected poems, which sadly is out of print, but which I recommend getting used. And that was translated by Ruth Feldman and Brian Swan. When they did this big, beautiful collected works of Primo Levi, which actually we did an event at the Birchfield when that came out, which was very nice, with the publisher and the translator, Ann Goldstein, who some of you know as the translator of Elena Ferrante. But Ann Goldstein edited the collected works of Primo Levi. And the translator for that is Jonathan Galassi, who's actually the publisher. I think he still is the publisher of Fair Strauss Giroux, or he used to be. I don't like his as well, to be honest. So I recommend getting the older collected poems by Ruth Feldman and Brian Swan, and those are the translations I'm using.
Great. Thank you.
So Primo comes back from the war, and he goes back to his hometown of Turin, Italy, and he starts working as a chemist and writing and trying to process what he's been through, buttonholing people like the Ancient Mariner and talking to them and telling them his story. Even though he was, not that gregarious a human, he felt compelled to tell even strangers what had happened to him at Auschwitz. But he's also sort of dealing with daily life. And before Auschwitz, he already suffered from depression. As a young man, he suffered from depression, and that's more or less what killed him many years later. So he's also just grappling with daily life, as well as what he's just been through. And so he writes this poem, Monday, about daily life in 1946. right about the same time, a week later than the poem than Shema. Very different tone. Monday, is anything sadder than a train that leaves when it's supposed to? That has only one voice, only one route? There's nothing sadder. Except perhaps a cart horse, shut between two shafts and unable even to look sideways. Its whole life is walking. And a man? Isn't a man sad? If he lives in solitude a long time, if he believes time has run its course, a man is a sad thing too. So here's this melancholy poem about something we can all relate to, Monday, getting up and having to go to work and being stuck in the rut. So in one sense, it's very ordinary, melancholy poem about that. But having just read that other poem, when you hear lines like, and a man, ? It's triggering in you this, more existential question of if this is a man, what is a man? And it's showing that for Primo Levi, these questions were raised by Auschwitz, but they were also raised by everyday life, particularly for a post-religious thinker. He needed to know, and he was a scientist, and he had this huge curiosity and this relentless quest to understand the world and the universe and human beings. And what is a man? And what is a person? And then, he has these very mundane issues, like he's lonely. And he really would love to have a girlfriend. And he doesn't really feel like a man in that sense, because he's, on his own, and he was kind of shy growing up, and he wasn't comfortable with girls, and he was Jewish and frail and sickly and bookish and got made fun of. So he has a lot of questions about being a man in that sense of being a man as well. Questions or got one, anyone want to ask one question about Monday or some thoughts spurred by Monday before we move on? Yeah.
I just have a thought. It just reminded me of the De Chirico painting over at the Buffalo AKG, who was Italian artist, futurist, who did it. It was the painting is The Enigma of Leaving or something. And in it, it's got a cart going and a train going all in one direction. So and it just made me think, I wonder if he knew De Chirico's work. And
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I absolutely love that painting. It's one of my favorite paintings at the Albright Knox. And I think it fits that mood of that poem perfectly. So it really makes me want to, pair them. And next time I do this, we'll have a slide of that painting. So for folks who don't know it, go look at that beautiful painting. So now it's just the next month. It's a couple weeks later, and Primo goes to a dance, and his cousin introduces him to a woman named Lucia, and they hit it off, and she listens to him and his stories, and they fall in love, and he instantly writes her this poem, February 11th, 1946. I kept searching for you in the stars when I questioned them as a child. I asked the mountains for you, but they gave me solitude and brief peace only a few times. Because you weren't there in the long evenings, I considered the rash blasphemy that the world was God's error, myself an error in the world. And when I was face to face with death, no, I shouted from every fiber, I hadn't finished yet. There was still too much to do, because you were there before me, with me, beside you, just like today, a man and woman under the sun. I came back because you were there. And this, I thought I would read to you so that you can sort of compare poetry and prose. In the periodic table, a critical chapter is called Chromium, and he describes meeting Lucia in that chapter. And I'll read you his account of that. Now it happened that the next day, destiny reserved for me a different and unique gift. The encounter with a woman, young and made of flesh and blood, warm against my side through our overcoats, gay in the humid mist of the avenues, patient, wise, and sure as we were walking down streets still bordered with ruins. In a few hours, we knew that we belonged to each other, not for one meeting, but for life, as in fact has been the case. In a few hours, I felt reborn and replete with new powers, washed clean and cured of a long sickness, finally ready to enter life with joy and vigor. Equally cured was suddenly the world around me, and exercised the name and face of the woman who had gone down into the lower depths with me and had not returned. Very beautiful tribute to his wife. But you notice the end of that chapter, that passage, somebody else was there.
Mhm.
And that someone else was a young woman that he had fallen in love with when he was a partisan trying to fight the Nazis very haphazardly. He describes himself like with basically a lady's Derringer pistol. He was not cut out to be a soldier, and many of his fellow partisans weren't. But he was falling in love with a fellow chemist named Wanda Maestro, and they were deported together to Auschwitz. And they actually were together in the train to Auschwitz and then torn apart from each other at Auschwitz. And she was murdered by the Nazis, I think 8 months later. And the week before he wrote the poem for Lucia, he wrote a poem about Wanda. And I don't have that one on a slide, but it's very short, so I'll just read it to you. And I'm actually going to read you two different translations because it's sort of interesting to compare. So this is 11 February 1946. This poem, which he wrote just a few weeks earlier, is titled 25 February 1944, which is the day at Auschwitz that Wanda was taken away from him. So very similar dates, both February, 2 years apart, commemorating very different things. So the poem 25 February 1944 goes like this. I would like to believe in something beyond the death that undid you. I would like to describe the intensity with which, already overwhelmed, we longed in those days to be able to walk together once again, free beneath the sun. I'll read you another translation of the same poem. I wish I could believe in something beyond the death that has undone you. I wish I could tell of the strength with which we longed then, already drowned, to walk together once again, free under the sun. That translation appeared like it was like a poem on the train thing in, I forget where, might have been in Germany, which would have been a very intense experience to read this poem on a train, but it was somewhere. I like that translation because it uses the word drowned, which is a very crucial word for Levi. One of his books is called The Drowned and the Saved, and it's a word that he tended to apply to people who were lost in the Holocaust, but it's a very complicated term for him. So he had just written this poem about Wanda. So now when we read this poem about Lucia, and we read these last lines in particular, he says, because you were there before me, with me beside you, just like today, a man and a woman under the sun. I came back because you were there, which if you think about it is a very odd thing to say about Lucia, who is not there, but is here. And it really seems as if he is mingling Lucia and Wanda in a very strange way. So that helps you to begin to understand some of the complexity of this man and this writer and this life. And this very beautiful love story about Lucia. Of course, things didn't work out all that great. They did stay married. They had 2 children. He appreciated her until he died. They had both his mother and her mother living with them, essentially, for many, many years, which was a very difficult situation for everyone concerned, I think. He had some loyalty to Lucia, but he also had at least two major affairs. So, things were not perfect. But he never lost his appreciation for the fact that she kind of saved his life in a certain way after the war, or she, he was reborn, as he describes here and in the prose passage. So we'll take one question or thought about those poems. Yeah,
Can I just make a comment?
Sure.
When I read this poem, I don't see Vanya in this. I just see it as a child, him yearning and longing for this love and not giving up on it. And then Lucia presents herself after. Like, I don't see it being two women, just the way that I'm perceiving it.
yeah. Well, hopefully Lucia read it the way you read it as well. And it's, I think it's very beautiful, and the stars, he had this lifelong, I said he wanted to be a physicist, he had this lifelong love of the stars, and the mountains. He was a mountain climber as a youth. That was part of how he sort of got over his kind of frail, sickly, bookish self, was by mountain climbing with friends and having adventures with them. And the rash blasphemy, the long evenings and the rash blasphemy, that's probably really before the war. That's probably not about Auschwitz. That's probably about being a young, questioning, unhappy guy alone in the mountains, or, alone in his room, and feeling like the world is completely wrong and I'm completely wrong. And so she was curing him of long-standing things, not just his war experiences. So let's move on to the next poem, written much later in life. And so I just mentioned that, he was an inorganic chemist. He was a mountain climber. He had trouble with women, and with sort of femaleness and mothers, and there's Mother Earth was sort of a troubling phenomenon for him for a lot of his life. He was kind of uncomfortable with kind of everything that portrays. But as he grew older and went through life and had all these different experiences and married and had children and had these other love affairs, he gradually got more interested in, more comfortable with, more celebratory of the organic world, the female world, the earthy world. Not that those are the same thing to me, but he identified them in he was a child of old-fashioned patriarchy in a lot of ways. So these sort of dichotomies that would not make sense to many people today, were what he was living with. But so as time went on, he sort of grew more comfortable with the organic. And this poem from later in life is sort of a beautiful testament to that. So it's called The Thaw. When the snow will all have melted, we shall search for the old path, the one that is being covered by brambles behind the monastery's walls. Everything will be as it was. On either side, amid the thick heather, we shall again find certain frail herbs whose name I would not know how to say. I read up on it every Friday, but every Saturday it leaves my mind. I've been told they are rare and good for curing melancholy. The ferns bordering the road are like tender creatures. They barely push up from the ground, curled in a spiral, and yet right now they are ready for their loves, alternate and green, more intricate than ours. Their germs chafe at the bit, tiny males and tiny females in the rusty sporangium. They will erupt at the first rain, swimming in the first drop, eager and agile. Long live the bride and groom. We are tired of winter. The bite of frost has left its mark on flesh, minds, mud, and wood. Let the thaw come and melt the memory of last year's snow. So that one I feel like is somewhat self-explanatory, but for him to be saying "Long live the bride and groom" and celebrating the organic world in this way was somewhat new for him. And you notice the herbs are beyond the brambles, and the herbs are beyond the monastery's walls. So there's this sense of sort of, getting beyond his kind of monkish tendencies that he maybe had earlier in life. In this poem. So one question or thought about the thaw?
Well, one thought actually that I
Mhm.
have, because I studied Italian and I studied Italian literature. And even though we really never, his works were never in any of my books, but I would love to read these poems in Italian simply because of the sound of the language. And I think it would be really cool. And I mean, the translators on this really, I think, do it justice. It's difficult. It's not,
Yeah.
because I did some translating and it's a very difficult task to take on. But, this one here, just in particular, I'm thinking, I would really like to see how it was written in Italian, because
Yeah.
sometimes, but they did such a great job of using words where you could create like the sound and you could see what it was.
Yeah, thanks. So our next poem is Passover. I mentioned that he was non-observant. He grew up in a very secular household. The Italian Jews were among the most assimilated Jews in the world, really. And he and his family really looked down on Eastern European Jews. And actually part of his alienation in Auschwitz was that most of the Jews there, overwhelming majority of them, were from Eastern Europe, and they spoke Yiddish, and they were not as educated and cultivated and assimilated as he was. And he didn't speak their language. He didn't know their rituals and their legends very well. And he was, snobby. He was snobby about Eastern European Jews, like his family was, and a lot of Italian Jews were. And this was another thing that really changed as his life went on. He got more and more interested in Judaism and in the world of the Eastern European Jews. He wrote a novel, If Not Now When, that's about Eastern European Jewish partisans fighting the Nazis in a very heroic way. So he kind of celebrated them in that novel and some of their culture. And though he never really became an observant Jew, he also became a little more observant and more interested in some of the rituals. And then he wrote this beautiful Passover poem, which, for those of you who have been to Seders, you'll recognize that he's very closely mirroring the language of the Passover Seder. So it's a very interesting contrast to the Shema, where he is using Jewish prayer and liturgy in one way. In this poem, he's using it in a very, very different way. Tell me, how is this night different from all other nights? How, tell me, is this Passover different from other Passovers? Light the lamp, open the door wide so the pilgrim can come in, Gentile or Jew. Under the rags, perhaps the prophet is concealed. Let him enter and sit down with us. Let him listen, drink, sing, and celebrate Passover. Let him consume the bread of affliction, the paschal lamb, sweet mortar, and bitter herbs. This is the night of differences, in which you lean your elbow on the table. Since the forbidden becomes prescribed, evil is translated into good. We will spend the night recounting far-off events full of wonder. And because of all the wine, the mountains will skip like rams. Tonight, they exchange questions, the wise, the godless, the simple-minded, and the child. And time reverses its course, today flowing back into yesterday, like a river enclosed at its mouth. Each of us has been a slave in Egypt, soaked straw and clay with sweat, and crossed the sea dry-footed. You too, stranger, this year in fear and shame, next year in virtue and in justice. I love this poem, and in fact, I read it every Passover at my family's Seder. And part of why I love it is that he doesn't have to say a word about Auschwitz or the Nazis, because we know who he is. And so when he says each of us has been a slave in Egypt, it has this whole other level of meaning without him really having to enunciate it at all, because he was literally a slave and survived. And it's also remarkable to me that the tone of this poem is so sort of mellow. I don't know a better word for it. There's a very relaxed quality to it. That's fascinating to me that he could achieve that, I guess. He's really, the imagery is straight from the Passover Seder. It's not original in that sense. And yet I find it a very original poem because of who he was and how exactly he expressed it. Yeah.
This might be a reach, but my thought is like, so I've been spending some time with Mark Nepo, and so a friend that's part of that group talks about Mark leads people on emotional alchemy. So I'm hearing opposites, like several places in that poem, there's opposites, and he seems comfortable with the opposites, and that's sort of like a combining of things that he seems okay with. That's my observation.
Yeah. So he's a chemist, and so he's a modern day version of an alchemist. And he has some beautiful writing about combining different substances and the beauty of impurity. He is a poet, so he cherishes ambiguity, even though his rational mind kind of rejects it. His poetic mind embraces it and embraces opposites commingling, and he, particularly as a victim of the Nazis and as well as a poet, he embraces impurity, not purity. So I think you're absolutely right. The next poem, Pliny, very different tradition that he's drawing on classical heritage of being an Italian, an heir to the Romans. So Pliny was a historian, a naturalist, a legislator in ancient Rome, and he died when Mount Vesuvius erupted, the eruption that gave us Pompeii. Epicurus, the Greek philosophers mentioned in the poem, some of the writing by Epicurus that's was preserved because it got embedded in Pompeii. But the legend that Levi's drawing on is that Pliny went out to investigate because he couldn't resist, because he was a scientist and he was so curious, and he got too close to Vesuvius and breathed in the fumes and died from that. Apparently that's not actually true, but that was the legend that was current when Levi was writing. So that's what he's drawing on. So this is him, in the voice of Pliny that evening. Don't hold me back, friends. Let me set out. I won't go far, just to the other shore. I want to observe at close hand that dark cloud shaped like a pine tree rising above Vesuvius, and find the source of this strange light. Nephew, you don't want to come along? Fine, stay here and study. Recopy the notes I gave you yesterday. You needn't fear ash on top of ash. We're ash ourselves, remember Epicurus? Quick, get the boat ready. It is already night. Night at midday, a portent never seen before. Don't worry, sister, I'm cautious and expert. The years that bowed me haven't passed in vain. Of course I'll come back quickly. Just give me time to ferry across, observe the phenomena, and return. Draw a new chapter from them tomorrow for my books that will, I hope, still live when for centuries my old body's atoms will be whirling, dissolved in the vortices of the universe, or live again in an eagle, a young flower, a young girl, a flower. Sailors, obey me. Launch the boat into the sea. There's probably a little echo of Odysseus there, as well as Pliny. Levi loved Odysseus and the Odyssey, and so you might think of Odysseus urging his sailors on at the end, as well as Pliny going off on his voyage. So just a few things to say about this poem. The end is very interesting to me because Primo, the non-believer, the scientist, the writer is thinking about, so what happens when you die? And what kind of survival can we hope for? And he really gives us two kinds at the end. One is that nature doesn't destroy anything and it reuses us and we live on. Our atoms live on in new forms. The other that I think is dearer to his heart is that he's a writer and he wants his books to live on, as Pliny's have, which is more, maybe a little more satisfying than having your atoms recombined into an eagle, a young girl, or a flower, if you're a writer. Thoughts or questions about that? Anyone on Zoom like to pose a question?
If anyone has questions online, just unmute and ask.
Otherwise, we'll read one last poem and then we'll have a more free-ranging discussion where we can talk about anything about him. To my friends, dear friends, I say friends here in the larger sense of the word. Wife, sister, associates, relatives, schoolmates, men and women, persons seen only once or frequented all my life, provided that between us, for at least a moment, was drawn a segment, a well-defined cord. I speak for you, companions on a journey dense, not devoid of effort, and also for you who have lost the soul, the spirit, the wish to live, or nobody or somebody, or perhaps only you, or you who are reading me. Remember the time before the wax hardened, when each of us was like a seal. Each of us carries the imprint of the friend met along the way. In each, the trace of each, for good or evil, in wisdom or in folly, each stamped by each. Now that the time presses urgently and the tasks are finished, to all of you, the modest wish that the autumn may be long and mild. Well, I thought that was a good poem for early November, but I also, wanted to end with it because I titled one of the chapters in my book, What We Make of Each Other. And because Primo Levi really didn't believe in God, and he loved nature in a certain way, but really he was a humanist. He was really most interested in people and how they related to one another. And the flip side of the fact that he thought that human beings could destroy each other was that he believed that, as I said, we are what we make of each other, so that the human soul is a mutual production, and it's something that we build together. And that's why youth is so important to him. As you hear in this poem, it's because youth is when we really influence each other the most. He wasn't terribly interested in kids. He loved youth and he was very interested in his youth. And weirdly enough, he identified Auschwitz in part with his youth because it made him what he was. But he once said that Auschwitz was his university. But that was the tragic part. But the comic part was this life of many close friendships and a real love of life, of eating and drinking and talking and mountain climbing and being with people. And his sense that friendships were so important because that is how we sort of make each other there are other ways too, but one of the most important ways that we build each other into actual human beings, because for him, a human being is an achievement. It's not a given. It's something that has to be created, but it can't be created alone.
Interesting.
So with that, we'll just throw it open for discussion. Yes.
I have a question, and I don't remember seeing a date at the beginning, but where was he in his life? How old was he when he wrote this poem?
So To My Friends is from the 1980s, so the end of his life, as was The Thaw and Pliny, those are all from toward the end. He had a real blossoming of poetry right after Auschwitz, and then continued writing poems. There's some great poems throughout, but then another real blossoming toward the end of his life.
I just love the last stanza, which almost, there's a liturgical, a humanist, if there's such thing as humanist liturgy, there's a liturgical sense to it for me.
Oh, I think so too. And, you know, he hoped there was such a thing because that's what he was trying to write. He thought that, you know, as a post-religious thinker, he thought that we had to do that ourselves, and we had to do it again. You know, we had to do it anew. Mussolini thought so too. And Mussolini actually issued a decalogue. So Mussolini created his 10 commandments, and one of them literally was that Mussolini's always right. So Levi is really, you know, he's grappling with this, you know, cosmos where he's not just going to follow the 10 commandments from the Bible, and he's not going to follow Mussolini's 10 commandments. So what's it going to follow? So he is trying to create a new liturgy of sorts, but he also is smart and modest enough to know that, you know, he's not a prophet, he's not a saint. So what can he do? He can sort of contribute to this mutual enterprise that he thinks is going on.
One thing that I find interesting about, especially this particular poem as well, is that I read about how many people thought that he had committed suicide.
Yeah, so we should talk a little bit about that. So the end of his life is a leap or a fall from the in his apartment building down the stairwell, and most of his biographers think it was a leap, but there are people who think it was a fall. And then you could take the middle point of view that it was maybe he didn't try very hard not to fall, or something along those lines. He was very depressed when he died, so a leap kind of makes the most sense. His grandfather actually died the same way, with a leap, and he, in his writing, talked about leaps in that way. So that's probably what it was, but it's, you know, you can't be positive. His death became very important in discussing him for a number of different reasons. One was you still couldn't bury suicides in the main part of the cemetery. The rabbi said, well, he wasn't a suicide, it was delayed murder by the Nazis.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that it'd been a long time since Auschwitz, and he did not tend to attribute his depression to Auschwitz. It pre-existed Auschwitz. When he would tend to get really depressed was after he finished books, when he, you know, that incredible energy of writing a book ran out, and you know, he lost his will to live. So, you know, most likely he fell victim to depression. But no one can say for sure. Part of what was important for me in writing the book was to address that, but also not to obsess over the end of somebody's life, because the life is a lot more interesting than the end of it. I mean, the end is authentically interesting. And when I was writing my novel, I was quite interested in that question, and my character was interested in it. So, you know, it is, as human beings, we're very fascinated by that, and you do want to know, and it's not to shy away from it either, but also, you know, to do justice to the man and the life, which was, you know, he's a Renaissance man with an incredibly full life. Wrote all these books, novels, poetry, nonfiction, essays. He translated a number of books from several different languages. Translated Kafka, translated the great anthropologist Mary Douglas. I mean, he was such a wide-ranging person. Yeah.
Do we know why he had affairs and if he found solace in them?
It sounds like the second one in particular was quite satisfying for him. It was a close, long-standing relationship with someone he really loved and who loved him. Yeah, he and his wife loved each other and were loyal to each other, but also weren't, apparently not totally well matched. And as I mentioned, they had this very difficult home life, taking care of their two mothers. And he really wanted to get away from that a lot, and be free from that some of the time. And unfortunately, his wife, I think, got kind of lumped in with the world of duty. And, he was also interested in the world of fun and adventure. And so he found that elsewhere.
Was there ever any indication that maybe someone pushed him?
No indication of that.
But I hate to stick to the suicide story,
No.
but I read somewhere that he was on a lot of medication and that could possibly be why he fell. And I guess I
Yes.
embrace that idea because he does seem to be a man who loved life and
Yeah,
that understood how precious life was. And
yes.
so I've sort of held on to that
Mm.
thought that
Yeah, and that's absolutely possible. But I would just say he did really love life, as a lot of people with depression do. And he had many very happy times. And yeah, he was his father was a real bon vivant, and when he was younger, it kind of bothered his father and it bothered him that he was not really a bon vivant when he was younger.
I haven't heard anyone use that word.
Yeah. But as he grew older, he got to be kind of more of a bon vivant. And I just wanted to say one other thing about friends. But part of the thing I didn't mention is that friends also saved his life numerous times. So in Auschwitz, two different friends saved his life in very different, very interesting ways. So one was his good friend Alberto, who was a fellow chemist, fellow Italian, and the two of them were this inseparable pair. And so they stole stuff together and schemed together and kept each other's spirits up. And Alberto actually spoke German quite a bit better than Primo did. So in the first days, that was really critical to survival. And that really helped keep Primo alive. And then there was a second person who kept him alive, who was a stranger really, but became kind of a friend. And this was an Italian mason who had been conscripted by the Nazis to work outside of Auschwitz, building walls and things. So he wasn't in Auschwitz, he wasn't an inmate, but he was like forced labor, but he had a fair amount more freedom. He smuggled food to Primo, and that kept Primo alive. And Primo named both of his children after Lorenzo, the illiterate, alcoholic, stubborn, difficult, incredibly brave, beautiful person who saved his life in Auschwitz. Lorenzo's life also didn't end well. He drank himself to death, I think, in a small town in Italy. But he, Levi does him beautiful justice in the books, and as I said, named his children after him. And so when in the poem, when he talks about someone you only met once or other people with whom you have this relationship, it's that includes people like Lorenzo, who was this stranger who saved his life and became close to him in that way. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your book? So it's not a biography, it's an essay. And what is the structure of it and sort of?
Yeah, I never know quite how to describe it, but I have had to figure out ways to try. It's halfway between literary criticism and intellectual biography. It's more like literary criticism because, as I mentioned, what I really did was read all his work over and over again and draw relationships between it. But because his work is so much about his life, you cannot understand him without understanding his life. Thus, the two biographies that I drew very heavily on. So the way I proceeded in writing the book was I did start when he was born and end when he died. because his life is so critical to his work, that sticking with the biographical timeline made the most sense to me. But along the way, what I'm drawing on is his work, and trying to understand his work. Poetry was a little tricky because I kind of wanted to talk about it all at once, but he wrote it throughout his whole life. But I put it where I thought it made sense. But that's how the book works, more or less. So it's like a study kind of Primo Levi, his life and work. Yeah, Tony.
Is looking at his life from the standpoint of literary criticism. Let's establish the idea of the hero somehow, whether it's from epic poetry or from an essay by Carlyle or whatever, just some way of establishing this is a hero.
Yeah.
Is he a hero?
Yeah, I love that question. So I mentioned that he loved Odysseus. So one of my regrets about him is that his gravestone is just his name, his dates, and his Auschwitz number. I never would have put his Auschwitz number on his gravestone. Maybe he would have, I don't think so. But what he once said he wanted on his gravestone was a quote from the Odyssey describing Odysseus as forever wandering. That to me would have been beautiful. So he did identify with heroes. He was very interested in heroes. And I think part of the magic of his books is the way he portrays himself as a hero / anti-hero. So it was kind of hard for him to write. It's hard for him not to be a hero because he survived Auschwitz and then he survived this incredible adventure to get home, which is what the second book is about, The Truce, which is a wonderful book as well. And it's all about the Russians take him off to Russia and he's in camp in Russia. And then he has all these adventures and misadventures. And parts of it are very funny, actually. But again, like, how could he not be the hero of that adventure? He is, but he's also, very self-critical, self-mocking kind of hero. So that's a theme, I think, throughout his work is, he says, I just wanted to be a man, so I end my book, maybe I'll read you the very end of my book because it addresses this. Well, but that's the afterwards by Risa Sodi. That's not what I'm going to read you. The Italian publisher Einaudi had two famous authors named Levi. One was Primo. The other one was Carlo Levi, the author of Christ Stopped at Eboli. To distinguish them, the staff called Carlo Levi, Levi Cristo, and Primo Levi, Leve Uomo. All his life, Levi tried to be Leve Uomo. He said late in life, yes, I suppose I've wanted that too, without achieving it. To be myself, un uomo completo. To become and remain a man is an achievement, an arduous and incessant battle, the outcome of which is never guaranteed. As Levi said, since there is a very real risk of ruin, the only remedy is to roll up our sleeves and struggle as he did so patiently and beautifully for illumination. That's kind of my thought on Levi. I mean, he's my hero for sure, but he just wanted to be a human being.
What would there be in his life's unfolding that is not heroic? Are there?
Well, for him, the thing that was most not heroic was surviving Auschwitz. So that's part of why everything is so complicated. And that's why his book is called The Drowned and the Saved, which is his last book about Auschwitz is The Drowned and the Saved, which is about, it comes from Dante. It's a phrase Dante used to describe those in the Inferno versus those in Paradiso. But for Levi, it's very different. And one of the things he says is, well, the people who survived were the worst because they cheated and robbed and grabbed bread that could have gone to somebody else. Because it was a zero-sum game. Every extra crust of bread you got was a crust of bread someone else didn't get. And he and Alberto, they stole from the camp, not from their fellow prisoners. You know, a lot of the prisoners were stealing from each other. But you know, in Levi's view, it was, you know, that's what the Nazis, that was the ultimate crime, was that they turned the inmates against each other and created this situation of wolf against wolf instead of human beings. So for him, it was to survive meant that you were an anti-hero. But it was never that simple because he knew that there was something very heroic about what he had done. And he didn't completely resist that either. So that's why it's so fascinating to read his work and this oscillation between hero and anti-hero. And you know, hopefully coming to rest in the idea of complete human being, which doesn't, you know, which means a very flawed, difficult, depressed, amazing, funny, you know, human being. Yeah.
Were his poems published during his lifetime? Did he have a following?
His poems were published, but very kind of haphazardly. His kind of, the reception of him was very interesting because, you know, he's a painter. I mean, no, not a painter. He's managing a paint factory. He's not really tied into the literary world at all. So it's kind of a small publisher, publishes as if this is a man, doesn't sell a lot of copies. There's not a huge interest in Auschwitz memoirs and Holocaust memoirs when he first publishes it in the late 40s. So it just kind of goes away. He's busy getting married, having his first kids, running the factory, but he is still writing. And then the first book gets reissued some years later. And the second pressing of it touched a nerve. There was starting to be a real interest in learning about what had happened, teaching children about it, you know, hearing the testimony. And it became well known. And then his stature grew and grew, and he became a well-known prize-winning author in Italy. And then he kind of broke through internationally with the periodic table, which was quite a few years later. It got a blurb from Saul Bellow, and you know, a few other kind of key things happened, and it became like a quite popular book in the English-speaking world. So by the time he died, he was a famous author. He had resigned from the paint factory, which was good because it turned out he wasn't very good at managing. He was a good scientist, but he wasn't good at managing. He was bad at HR, and it was getting dangerous at the paint factory. So he'd resigned from that and was able to just write. So he achieved success, but not for his poetry at all. It was all his prose. And the poetry was out there a little, but it was very obscure because he didn't even care about it or didn't value it enough. Yeah.
What part of time of your life and what led you to latching on to him? Very beginning, very first time.
So I think I was in my young 20s, and I think I read a review or somebody told me, or you know, I don't know exactly. And I think you know, I read him, and little did I know years later I'd write a whole book about him. I wasn't that, you know. I had other writers I cared about more, but I, you know, really liked him, and I thought, if this is a man, was one of the, you know, most remarkable books I'd ever read, and something, you know, everyone should read. It's hard to read, of course, because it's about Auschwitz. It's not. I don't know how to describe it. The fact it's literature through and through. It's a very literary book. It's very beautifully written. It's very beautifully constructed. So in that sense, you know, it's like reading King Lear or Hamlet or something. It's very dark, but it's so beautifully put together that energy kind of carries you through it in a certain way. It's, you know, just fascinating too. It's as dark as it is.
Well, you're masterful with the package you put together in this.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you. Any
Well,
other questions?
Any other
before we
questions?
leave?
We'll take maybe one more.
Will there be another book?
Now I'm really interested in Walt Whitman, a very different person. So come back here on November 16th. We'll be down in the auditorium doing a program called Whitman on Walls. With these incredible films of Walt Whitman, sung and myself that this theater group made, and then live performance poets responding to them.
All right.
So
Write that down. Good.
my next book will probably be a book of my poetry with my wife's art called Abbott's Creek. Should come out hopefully next year. And then after that, maybe something on Walt Whitman. Probably nothing about Primo ever again, but.
Yeah. But you know, you can come back next year with your book, so, and we can do this again. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming,
Thank
and
you.
it's just a wonderful, wonderful discussion, and thanks to everybody here, you know, contributed so much to the discussion, but anyway, I said we'll see you next year.
Thank you, Sam. And thank all of you for coming, and remember, every every first Thursday of the month, December, Jack Foran will be with us with his book, The Lower West Side. And I have to mention that in January, we have our author here. David, pronounce your last name.
Happy.
And his book is called A Grateful Soul. So come back in January.
Awesome.
So thank you, Sam. It was really
Great.
wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah.